I think the problem that we have with organising today is that even collective institutions have been, paralysed by this sense of individualism. They've kind of been infected by individualism. So if you go back to, I write in the book about the example of the Lucas plan. So, contrast what happened at Boeing or, indeed what happened at Port Talbot with the example of the workers at Lucas Aerospace in the 1970s. Their company was kind of under threat from rising competition from abroad. They appealed to the then Labour government saying, we want you to nationalise us. And Tony Benn, the then Minister for Trade and Industry, replied and said, we can't do that right now. You guys need to come up with a plan as to how you can save this firm yourself. And Ben was, again, one of these big believers in democratic socialism. And so the workers were like, right, okay, what do we do? And the union representatives basically surveyed all of the workers at Lucas Aerospace and said, what do you think we should do? How could we transform the operation of this largely weapons manufacturer, basically? And the workers came back and they said, we need to transform this institution into a worker-owned, democratically run organization that produces socially useful commodities, not weapons, basically. And they put together this document called the Lucas Plan, which was just probably one of the most radical documents in Britain's economic history. It comprised ideas that had been put forward by workers from throughout Lucas Aerospace to use the tools and the skills that were then available to them to transition from the production of weapons to things like kidney dialysis machines, wind turbines, things that would be useful for society. And at the same time, these workers had said, this is how we'll manage ourselves. This will be the ownership structure of the organization. This is the way that we'll transition to this new way of working. It was this incredible business plan, basically, that totally undermined the spirit of capitalism, which is that the owners own the firm, the managers manage the firm on their behalf, and the workers do as they're told. And this is all based on the idea that entrepreneurs and workers and managers are these really clever people who just know how an organization should work and are really good at telling people what to do. And workers at Lucas Aerospace were like, no, we know exactly how this firm should be run. We know what we should be doing. We're perfectly capable of managing ourselves. And that's why it was so much more threatening to the established order than even the idea of nationalisation. There's loads of companies that were nationalised at the time. This was something else entirely. It threatened this idea that people need to be managed and controlled. And I think that is actually the most threatening thing the most threatening thing that we can believe in a capitalist economy. It's that we don't need to be managed and controlled, that we have the power to govern ourselves, basically. And there are a load of really amazing examples of people doing exactly that in the book. One of the ones that's closest to my heart, we mentioned Port Talbot. There's this little town in North Wales called Blaenau Ffestiniog, which is one of these kind of left behind areas. It's a former slate mining community. And instead of kind of, allowing themselves to be consigned to this idea of like a left behind neighborhood, the people in this town got together. A few people started and they basically said, we're going to start a community enterprise to create jobs in the local area and give people a fighting chance. And as soon as people saw a couple of people do this, they were like, why can't we set up a community enterprise? Why can't we set up a community-owned energy company that will provide us with cheap energy instead of, paying tons of money to these, privatized utility companies when there's hydroelectric power that's being, monopolized by this corporation that's extracting all the wealth from this community. We could actually just generate our own power ourselves. And suddenly you had all of these community enterprises springing up, just this incredible ethos of self-help. There was some support through something called the Communities First programme by the Welsh government. But largely speaking, this was people just being like, we don't have to accept things being this way. You see a similar sort of thing in Preston, for example, where you have the community wealth building agenda. The council is supporting the creation of cooperatives, democratic local banking, all these different things. The participatory budgeting movement that's spread around the world, where residents are given the power to determine how their municipal budget is spent. The evidence is just so clear that when people start to believe that they have the power to be able to govern themselves, to be able to make decisions about their communities, about their workplaces, they take that power and they wield it in service of the collective of their community, of the people around them. They basically use it to build socialism. And the biggest thing standing in the way of our getting from here to there is just this pervasive and widespread belief that I am on my own, there's nothing I can do, the powers that are united against me are too strong, and, no one else wants to work with me to change things. Which is actually why I believe, I'm not saying that like all these small individual examples of like the resistance to capitalism or neoliberalism are going to be enough to shift the nature of the whole system. What I am saying is the biggest thing standing between us and progressive change is basically individualism. And these examples of people working together to resist their exploitation, to build, better communities, they just shatter individualism. You go to these communities and people do not share this like individualistic competitive mindset. They have, their own personal dreams and aspirations and wants and a secure sense of their own self, but they also view their identity as tied to what happens to the people around them.
I'm really struck by these examples of like what a better future possibly looks like within the context of what you said earlier about our political paradigm, that there is essentially basically a binary, right, about the size of the state and the size of welfare. So how do you see that better future sitting within something that kind of, I guess you could call technocratic governance,
yes.
right? The sort of the managerialism of Prime Minister Sunak or likely a Prime Minister Starmer.
Yeah, I mean, it just means democratizing everything, like just demanding more power being handed down to, whether that's local communities, whether it's devolution and decentralization, whether it's demanding workers are able to take power within their organizations, the removal of the massive restrictions that have been placed on our rights to do things like protest and assemble and speak out against the horrors that are being committed by our government here and all over the world. It really requires like a reinvigoration at the political level, when we're thinking about politics, a reinvigoration of the idea of democracy, basically. Now, we live in a country where the kind of liberal democratic revolution of the kind that, we saw during the 1800s, that hasn't even been completed. We've still got a monarchy. We've still got an unelected chamber in the House of Lords. We still have a private corporation that runs the heart of our financial sector, the City of London Corporation, which is a private corporation in the guise of a public local authority. So we have these hangovers from the feudal era that undermine democratic processes. And on top of that, we have these neoliberal shifts that have aimed to insulate even more areas of the state from democratic accountability. So, we have like the Bank of England being made independent, i.e., not subject to democratic scrutiny, which means that its decisions are much more likely to be influenced by the financial sector that has the ear of bank officials than they are the preferences of ordinary people. You have just the outsourcing of huge swathes of public services to private corporations that you cannot really control, you cannot really hold accountable. They're supposed to be held accountable by the government, but the people who write the contracts according to which these services are procured also consult for the firms that are bidding for those contracts. It's this kind of revolving door of corporate power that connects like public sector institutions with private sector outsourcing organizations. There's no real democratic accountability there. You've seen a massive centralization of power. When Thatcher came to power, she smashed the GLC. The guy who was instrumental in putting together the Lucas plan, after he was fired from Lucas for union organising, went to work for the GLC, the Greater London Corporation, which was then kind of sponsoring these ideas around how you could make democratic planning a reality, how you could start to bring the ideas that we saw at Lucas Aerospace to the public sector. Thatcher crushed the GLC precisely because it was doing some of that interesting experimentation. We're seeing again this kind of revival of that type of movement around democratic planning in places like Preston. And that's why places like Preston are seen as so threatening to the status quo. It's why we haven't seen what should be like, I spoke to a Conservative the other day who said that community wealth building should be a Conservative policy. It should be handing power back to communities, but they can't accept the idea that would happen because it runs contrary to this spirit of hierarchy that is really what underpins capitalism. So yeah, like that shift towards community power and towards worker power and people power is so deeply threatening to the status quo. And it really requires us to just like, yes, kind of combat this mindset of individualism, and also just like resist. It becomes so hard to think about, constructive ways of resisting in the system that we have. All we can do is we kind of go online and we maybe like fire off an angry tweet every now and again, because we look at the system and it seems so broken. But actually, if you're able to kind of get offline and get into spaces where people are organizing with tenants to like prevent rogue landlords, organizing with migrants to support them, to fight for their rights, just protesting on the street, getting out and, making your voice heard to the political class. All of these forms of resistance are yes, they're reactive, but they're also constructive, because you start to build these bonds and these subjectivities that allow us to think beyond this like toxic individualism and hierarchy that makes up our current system.